Welcome back, my dear listeners and students. This time we are going to look at understanding history. Last time we looked at sources of history. Now, this time, let us look at how we understand history. As we said earlier, history is a complex subject in which we study events and activities, people, culture, environment, leaders, the ordinary people, systems of governments, and so forth. And understanding these things is not easy. So the question is, how do we understand them? If they are not easy, then how do we understand them? History is an inquiry into human events or learning based on a certain facts. The facts, we must be sure of these facts. And history is also recorded past activities of humans based on research. That means we must do research. Histories are confined to such past events which are recorded or they are remembered. Then historians infer or recognize them on the basis of the available records or memories. So that is how we begin diving into understanding of history. History is also the analysis and interpretation of the human past, enabling us to study continuity and the changes that are taking place over time in human society. And understanding these things is not easy. History is also an act of both investigation and imagination that seeks to explain how people change over time. We change. The way you are today is not the same way you will be tomorrow. So that one makes it complex to understand the history. It is that so there is a writer who says that the past is intelligible to us only in the light of the present, and we can fully understand the present only in the light of the past. So you can see how we dangle between these things, past, present, then past, present, present, past. So that makes history very complex. History also shares some commonality with the myth, legend, epic, poetry, novelty. However, it is divergent from these forms because the truth of history is based in part on the fact that all the persons, activities, or events that are described in history must have really existed or occurred at some point in time. Historians can say nothing about these persons or events or activities without support or evidence suggested. So there must be evidence if you are to understand the history. Such evidences take the form of something written, as we said earlier, the written letters, government files, and many others which we had talked about. That they all help us to understand history. In addition, historians sometimes create their own evidence by interviewing the people. So that also helps us to understand the history. But in the 20th century, historical evidences greatly expanded to include things like aerial photography, old coins, clothes, motion pictures, and so forth. So these also help us to understand the history. It is a complex area, as you can see from this point of view. And then from the 21st century historian, understanding the past of people, activities, events is more accurate than those who did it before the development of technology. So you can see that. Then historians use all forms of evidence to examine, interpret, revisit, and interpret the past. These include not only written records, but also oral communications. objects such as buildings, artifacts, photography, and paintings. They are also trained, the historians are also trained in the methods of discovering and evaluating the historical sources and the challenges and the challenging task of making historical sense out of these records. So it is, you can see the complexity there. The different interpretations of the past allow us to see the present differently and therefore also emerging and work towards the future, which future is expected to be different. So now in all of this, there are three factors that now help us to understand the whole thing. The first is what we call historicity. The second is what we call a historicism. The third is what we call historiography. These three factors help us to find out the truth of history, the falsehood in history, and how history is written and with the intentions of history. So you can see, then what is historicity? Historicity is the historical factuality of persons, activities, and events. These things really exist. That is what historicity talks about, the actuality, the authenticity, and factuality of history or historical evidence as presented. Man, what is in historicity? What actually historicity contains? In historicity, there are three key areas. The historical actuality. This key factor in historicity addresses the question whether what we are talking about really existed. Did Jesus exist as documented? For example, that is historicity. In our country, Uganda, people talk of Amin eating people. Did Amin really eat people? That is historicity. When we were growing up, they used to tell us that when Museveni was fighting in Ilwero, he used to turn into cats. But is it true? These are the things you ask when, as far as historicity is concerned in a historical actuality. Then there is what we call the contextual development. How is history developed contextually? It tells us that history emerges from concepts and institutions, specific origins. It evolves over time. So the interpretation of these concepts and institutions cannot remain the same. That is history. Then the third aspect is what we call the situatedness. This highlights that human understanding is bound by congruent historical circumstances where a total view of knowledge, the view of knowledge being impossible. This is where people make a joke, and if you are not serious, you take that joke as history. As history, I think those of you who study European history, you can say there is a statement that somebody learned nothing and forgot nothing. Was that a historical fact, or it was a joke just describing something? So I hope you have got that. And then we go to what we call a historicism. This is the denial of history. The people who deny history, historical context, the significance and development, often treating events, people, or ideas as if they are independent of time, or even denying that they did exist. So that is what we call a historicism. That is what we call a historicism. And it also describes a person's failure to frame an argument or an issue using historical context or disregarding historical fact or implication of the statement. For example, our leaders in Uganda, we blame the past leaders. In the current government, we blame the past leaders without looking into the context in which they lived and they ruled. So that means you are forgetting the facts of their time, and you are judging them from your only period of time. The last one is what we call historiography. This one explains how history is written. And if history is written, it helps you to see who has written this from which perspective, because people can put in their opinions and making us to believe that they are historical facts, which at the end distorts history. So this one also helps us to look at the method of writing history. How do historians write history? And the discipline embedded in that. So the concept of historiography helps us to do that. So to summarize that, we say the three aspects of historicity, historicism, and historiography help us to now understand history. I hope you have got something from that explanation, and I want to leave you with some 4 questions. 1, discuss the meaning and significance of history, historicity, and historiography. 2, examine the causes and the consequences of a historicism. 3, in which ways can a modern history student avoid a historicism? Finally, to what extent does personal opinion influence history? Thank you so much for listening to me. I wish you the best. We shall meet in the next lesson.